So on Tuesday, we're going to be finishing up with Rousseau. So you're going to be doing we're going to be reading the last 26 pages and then doing your last free write on this. And then we're going to be transitioning into working on the paper. Once we have finished our, writing day in class and our peer review day, we will then, we're going to combine with my other Comp 2 section that meets at 12:30. They'll start coming at 2. And we'll start the reacting to the past thing. I'll assign people parts. You'll have to learn what your particular character's goals and motivations are. And then we'll get that started in the following weeks. But does anybody have any questions about assignments or about stuff that's coming up? Yeah, Brittany.
So we would only have 2 class days to work on it in class, like the paper.
Yeah, there's going to be a writing day in class and then a peer review day. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to start. You can start writing it before we do the in class day, right? You don't have to start then. That just gives you a day when I will be present for you to ask me questions. You can also come to my office and talk to me, right? Honestly, the reason why I do that is that I found that more people turned in work if I assigned a day in class where people would do some writing. Any other questions about stuff that's coming up? Okay, then let me just kind of break down quickly what I want to do today. I also want to apologize for not having your free writes from last time to get back to you. It's been a week, so I'll have everything graded and back to you on Tuesday again. So I want to start with any questions or comments that you have about Rousseau so far. Then I want to see if we can pull any general values or principles out of what we've read so far. So do you remember when we're finishing up with Voltaire, right? We tried to figure out how the book was an expression of a kind of particular worldview and what that worldview looked like. We're going to try to do the same thing with Rousseau, but we're going to start that today rather than next time. And then we'll work on a breakdown of what Rousseau says in Book 3, if we haven't already got to that in the previous class divisions here. Okay, so does anybody have any questions or comments about what you read for today? Or about Rousseau overall so far?
I just noticed that in Book 3 he just goes deeper in depth about what types of government he thinks and what they consist of.
Okay, so Book 3, is primarily concerned with government, right? What is it? What types there are? Right, and how does it work, right? So, did it seem to you like he was making an argument for any particular form of government or any particular principles in government?
Yeah, definitely he was pro-elective aristocracy.
Yeah, he states at one point that he thinks that that's the best form of government, right? Elected aristocracy.
And something else I noticed whenever he was whenever he was describing elected aristocracy, it just sounded a lot like our government today, way more than when he was describing democracy.
Yeah, what does Rousseau actually mean by democracy?
A true democracy.
And what does that look like?
You said that every citizen, they have a part in the government.
Yeah, and so where does he, in what kind of society does he argue a democracy, like a democracy of that sort, can actually work?
Smaller. Everybody's like-minded.
Yeah, if you've got a small, simple society in which there's little to disagree over, right? He also mentions that democracy works better in colder climates and in places where you have to work harder to get the land to produce enough to sustain you, right? And why would that be more fertile grounds for democracy? Why would a country in which you have to work harder be fertile grounds for democracy?
So in order to persist, you have to not be at odds with each other.
Okay, yeah, on the one hand, yeah, simple survival probably requires more cooperation, right? But we can even think about it in terms of how much the land produces, right? If you live in a place where it takes a lot of work and effort to get the land enough to produce enough to feed the population, how much excess is there likely to be?
A little.
Yeah, you're not exactly talking about abundance here, right? You're talking about a society that basically produces enough to feed itself, and that's about it, right? So, if there's less stuff to fight over, right? If there's less excess to fight over, then it's easier to decide on an equitable distribution of goods for everybody, right? Theoretically, I'm just trying to, this is not necessarily my opinion, I'm just trying to lay out Rousseau's logic for you. Now, monarchy, he says, tends to thrive in places where there is abundance, because then, when everybody has enough to eat, there is also enough to support a leisure class, right? If the land produces food abundantly with little effort, then the excess has to go somewhere. And better that it go to the support of, say, a prince, than that it be exported or wasted. I'm not sure I buy that, but that's his argument, right? But where does he seem to think these elected aristocracies tend to work best, and what kind of climate? I think this tells us a lot about a general value or principle that he holds throughout the book.
Probably warmer.
Well, what tends to lie in between
Moderation.
cold and hot? Yeah. So he talks about temperate climates as being more suited to aristocracies, right? Now, let's think back to what we said about the general will last time. What we compared the general will to. What was the general will? Or what did he describe it in terms of?
Where people can meet at, balance.
Yeah, it's like balance. I think Michaela, you described it as being almost like an average, right? In fact, he frequently uses the word mean to talk about it. So it's like an average of all the individual wills in a given society. So I think we can see here in a lot of Rousseau's work a kind of preference for a middle point between extremes, right? It seems like whenever he sets up two extremes, the thing he thinks is good is the thing that lies in between them, right? So, temperate zones, certain kinds of aristocracy, right? Balance and moderation overall. I mean, Personally, I read the whole, dividing up governments by climate zones things as a little bit far-fetched. But it seems to be in keeping with a general theme in the whole work, right? What other things did you guys pick up on? What else did you notice?
He makes a lot of references to civilization. Like he said the North American savages and Spartans.
Okay, so yeah, he does try to use a lot of real world examples, right? Sometimes poorly understood real world examples. But yeah, and I think there are particular examples he uses more frequently than others as well, right? And I think it might also be a good idea to try to break down how he's using particular examples, right? So, for example, when he talks about North American societies, right, he uses the word savage, which would have been current in his own time, right? We would not use that word today typically. But yeah, he uses it to, what does he mean by savage, do you think? Like, how do you think he's using the word? What kind of society does he mean to describe by it?
When was this book published?
This book was first published in 1762.
So it was either colonists or the Native Americans.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, when he talks about the North American civilizations, he is talking about Native Americans, yes. But I mean, like, what kind of society is that word intended to depict?
Like the uncivilized.
Yeah, like a society at a relatively simple level of sophistication for Rousseau's purposes, right? So he's talking about aristocracy here. On page 46, right? Can I get somebody to read the sentence that starts with "the first societies"? Yeah, thank you.
The first societies governed themselves aristocratically.
Yes.
The heads of the families took counsel together on public affairs. The young bowed without question to the authority of experience, hence such names as priests, elders, senate, and gerontes.
Yeah, old people. Old people invested with authority.
Fair enough. Savages of North America govern themselves in this way even now, and their government is admirable.
Okay, so let's pause here for a second, right? So what kind of government is Rousseau describing here? What kind of society is he describing? The fact that he says the first societies.
Based on age-ish.
Yeah, okay, so the aristocracy here, right? So leaders are selected in terms of age and experience, right? In this particular model. Right. The heads of families take counsel together. Older people are assigned positions of authority, and the young obey the old, right?
This is why the native chieftains were always like on the older side of their tribes.
Yeah, often, yeah. And I think that seems at least to be the assumption Rousseau is making about these societies, right? But the fact that he refers to savages and the first societies tells us what? What level of development does he believe this reflects in terms of, civilization?
I mean, they haven't developed far enough or had enough people to really justify having a developed government like France.
Yeah, I mean, this is, for Rousseau, the government that suits a nation that has not developed very far yet, right? A nation that is still relatively small and simple. Now, can I get somebody to read the paragraph that follows that starts with, "but in proportion as artificial inequality"?
I'll read it.
Thank you, Caroline.
But in proportion as artificial inequality produced by institutions became predominant over natural inequality, riches or power were put before age, and aristocracy became elective. Finally, the transmission of father's power along with his goods to his children by creating patrician families made government hereditary, and there came to be senators of 20.
Okay, thank you. So let's look particularly at the second half of the paragraph here. Do y'all know what this word patrician means? Anybody ever heard this word before?
Sounds like patriotism.
It does, and I think it comes from the same root, but like kind of moving in a different direction. So it is a word that comes from Latin. Have any of you heard the word plebeian before? Okay, what is a plebeian?
Well, I've heard of it.
Okay, you've heard the word, but you don't.
Like common people?
Yeah. So these are the two basic divisions of ancient Roman society, right? And I'm way oversimplifying here. It was actually much more complicated than this. But typically, what's meant by patrician are the upper classes, right? The ruling class and the wealthy. Right, a hereditary ruling class. And the plebeians, the everyone else. So you can think of the patricians as being like, in the French model, the first and second estates, right? And the plebeians as being like the third estate. So, does Rousseau seem to think that the creation of a patrician class, based on the transmission of the father's power along with his goods to his children, is a good thing? Why not?
Hereditary aristocracy is often ended up in, for lack of better terms, tyranny.
Yeah, I mean, and why does he point out that a hereditary aristocracy leads to very young senators, like people taking power at a very young age? How is this different from the natural aristocracy he describes up here?
They don't need to go to their people in order to take power.
Yeah, they don't necessarily need the vote, right?
Or the approval,
Or any approval, right?
And then I was good.
Why not?
Or no.
What would a 20-year-old senator lack that a 60-year-old senator would have?
experience.
Experience, yeah. This leads to people with very little life experience, right? Taking the reins of government. Now, again, we've got plenty of senators and representatives who are older than dirt, right? In fact, I think like the average age of one of our federal, like a member of our federal elected government is 65. Might even be older. And that doesn't really necessarily seem to be getting us better results. But yeah, Rousseau's argument here is that if we're just elevating people based on their family name, right, it means we're going to elevate a lot of people who are frankly unqualified for the job and who haven't been chosen by anybody, right? So the idea of an elected aristocracy for one thing, who's doing the electing? Who's going to choose?
The people votes.
Mm-hmm. So then the people elected will be an expression of what? The general will, yes. And for Rousseau, can the general will ever be wrong? The general will is always right. Right? So, naturally, if we trust the general will to select the members of our government, it will select the best people. Again, we can see in practice, this hasn't always worked out.
I guess
Right.
it would work better if there was a unified general will.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of societies, it's often 2 or 3, 4 different general wills.
Well, and I think, Rousseau would argue there can't be more than one general will, because if you have more than one general will, you don't actually have a functioning society. Right? Remember that, like, the idea here is that the general will is the average of all of the individual wills in a given society, and is devoted only to the common good. So once you start dividing up into factions, right? Or once people start pursuing what Rousseau calls their particular interest over the general common good, that's when things start to break down. So I think it's probably worth noting. I want to go back for a minute. I want to go back in a minute and actually define what Rousseau means by government, right? But I think first it's probably a good idea to break down how he actually imagines the social contract and what's radically different about it from what people like Hobbes and Locke were arguing, right? So let's go back for a second. I know that we, covered Hobbes again last time, but it never hurts to remind ourselves. What's Hobbes' basic theory of government? What's the purpose of a government for Hobbes? What is the government supposed to do?
Reflect the common people.
Does Hobbes actually think that government reflects the will of the people?
Oh, well, their best interest.
Like, doesn't you want just one person above everybody?
It doesn't necessarily have to be one person, but it's probably easier that way. What does Hobbes view as government's primary function? What's it supposed to provide?
So protection, control.
Yes, protection and security, right? So in Hobbes' social contract theory, we give up some of our liberties and some of our goods to the government in exchange for protection from foreign enemies and from each other, right? Because if there's no one to arbitrate disputes between us, right, there's nothing to stop all of us in this room from just killing each other and taking each other's stuff, right? If we decide for whatever reason that we all really want Ethan's binder, right? The person who's going to get it is the last one standing. So either the cleverest one who can trick everybody else into killing each other and take it, or the strongest person who can simply overwhelm everybody else, right? So that's Hobbes' state of nature, the thing he's trying to protect against, right? Because Hobbes thinks that people are basically horrible. Now, what about John Locke? What did Locke argue government existed to protect?
Liberties?
Yeah, exactly. Locke argued that the government's purpose was to protect our natural and civil rights, right? Right. Essentially, that we gave up some of our natural rights to the government in exchange for protection of our civil rights, right? So, what do both of these, what do these theories have in common with each other? Okay, there's a give and take. Yeah, the people give something up, right? Do the rulers actually give anything up?
Depends on the type of ruler.
Probably depends on the type of ruler, yeah. But on the whole, most of the giving up is on the part of the people, right? And is the ruler treated as something separate from the people or something that's part of the people? Yeah, something separate, or a separate body that's set apart for whatever reason, right? Now let's look at how Rousseau thinks about this, right? On page 66, that the institution of government is not a contract. So can I get somebody to start reading for us, starting with the legislative power once well established? Go ahead.
The legislative power, once well established. The next thing is to establish similarly the executive power. For this latter, which operates only by particular acts, not being of the essence of the former, is naturally separate from it. Were it possible for the sovereign, as such, to possess the executive power, right and fact, would be so confounded that no one could tell what was law and what was not. And body politic, thus disfigured, would soon fall a prey to the violence it was instituted to prevent. As the citizens, by the social contract, are all equal and all can prescribe what all should do, but no one has a right to demand that others shall do what he does not do himself. It is strictly this right which is indispensable for giving the body politic life and movement. That sovereign, in instituting the government, confers upon the prince.
Okay, let's pause here for a second, right? So let's remember that sovereign here, right, is that power possessed by the general will, by the people, right, to confer legitimacy on government, right? The sovereign power is what legitimates government, and it's always contained within the people. So what does that mean about Rousseau's view of government? Can the government actually be separate from the people if the power of legitimacy always rests with the people? Now, the government has to be of the people, right? And remember, like, what some of the prevailing theories were in Hobbes and Locke's day, right? For example, what was Charles I's theory of what made him a legitimate king?
Divine right.
Yep, divine right, right? God chose me as the special representative of England on earth, right? And we know where that got him. So, yeah, so previous theories of rulership and of legitimacy, right, treated the king as the government as somehow different in kind from the people, right? Not just one of the people who was elevated above the others for whatever reason. And this is the big difference here in Rousseau's theory, right? What does Rousseau assume all people are within the general will? Where do we stand in relation to each other?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Okay, so within the general will, according to Rousseau, where do all people stand in relation to each other? Yeah, everybody's equal, right? So none of us has the right to force anyone else to do something that we wouldn't do ourselves. Which means that any government that's given the power to enforce laws exists as an extension of the people's will, right? Not as something separate from it that we make a deal with. Right? It's not like, the P-Funk mothership lands in England, and, you know, aliens come out of it, and we make a compact with them to protect us, right? The government actually comes from the people, and is, as such, subservient to the people, not the other way around, right? So when Rousseau is talking about a social contract, he's not talking like Hobbes and Locke are about a contract between a government and a people. Who's involved in the contract that holds society together according to Rousseau? Yeah. The social contract is the thing that holds the general will together, right? The social contract is the thing that combines the people, right? That provides social unity, not a deal we make with someone else. Does this make sense? Everybody with me? Okay. And so how do we continually reaffirm our social contract? What do the people need to do periodically?
Elect new officials.
Yeah, or they have to assemble, right?
Re-elect.
Yeah, and elect new officials, or participate in public debate, right?
Rotation of power.
Yeah, however it's done, right? There has to be a periodic kind of like coming together and renewal of the general will, right? The people have to assemble at certain times and reaffirm that contract, reaffirm that unity. So, we might say that we do this through elections. Other societies might do this in other ways, right? But yeah, that would be the same kind of situation, the same kind of renewal. So we do need to go back for a second and try to figure out what Rousseau actually means by government. So were you able to discern this? Like, were you able to figure out for yourselves how he would define government, or what a government is? And I get, by the way, that this is all a little bit thorny and confusing. But I do also want to affirm that y'all are doing better with this than you probably think you are. If we get time, I just want to stick a pin in this too. I also want to talk a little bit more about this body politic metaphor that he keeps using, and maybe a little bit about its history and context.
He calls government the legitimate exercise of executive power.
Okay, yes. I call then government, page 38, or supreme administration, the legitimate exercise of the executive power, and prince or magistrate, the man or the body entrusted with that administration. So, the government is the thing that enacts the laws that the people make, right? That are legitimized by the sovereign power invested in the people. That's probably about the simplest summation we can make of this, right? And when Rousseau uses words like magistrate, prince, king, right? He's using those words more or less interchangeably. And he means, he doesn't necessarily mean an individual by them either. Basically, it's whatever body the general will chooses to invest power in, right? Okay. So, what do y'all think? What do y'all think of this body politic metaphor? Like the way he keeps talking about society in terms of a body.
I'm guessing they'll have to work together to,
Okay, yeah, and this is a really old metaphor, right? That predates Rousseau. We saw Hobbes using it, at least visually, on the first page of Leviathan. And there's a kind of even earlier model of this that refers to monarchy, right? So I want to kind of trace the development of this a little bit, and I think it might kind of help us understand what Rousseau's doing with it. So in the Renaissance, one of the prevailing theories of rulership was called the two bodies of the king. So let's take our current example on the British throne, right? Now, back when British monarchs had responsibilities that didn't involve waving at people from cars or occasionally opening a shopping center or christening a ship, they were regarded as essentially being two separate people in one body, right? Or kind of two separate bodies occupying the same space. So our current British monarch would, on the one hand, be a private citizen by the name of Charles Windsor, who is just like every other private citizen. But he is also, as Charles III, the embodiment of the nation of England, its government, and its aspirations, right? This was the prevailing view of kingship in the Renaissance. This idea that the king literally had kind of two bodies in the same space. What's missing from this theory of kingship? Who's not part of the body, of either body?
The people.
Yeah, the people, right? It doesn't matter, right? Now, at least in Hobbes's model, the Leviathan, right? The body of the king was made up of the people, all looking up towards him for protection, right? But the king can't do anything unless the people consent to it first, right? Once the people consent, as long as the king is protecting and securing them, then they're all good, right? But the people provide the material for the body, and the king is the head and the arms, right? The head that directs the movement, and the arms that swing that sword and wield that scepter, right? Now, in Rousseau's model, what's different? Let's move to page 60 when he talks about the death of the body politic. And can I get somebody to start reading the paragraph on page 60 that starts with the body politic as well as the human body? Preferably someone who hasn't read yet.
I'll read.
Thank you, Brittany.
The body politic, as well as the human body, begins to die as soon as it is born and carries in itself the cause of its destruction. But both may have a constitution that is more or less robust and suited to preserve them a longer or a shorter time. The constitution of man is the work of nature, that of the state the work of art. It is not in men's power to prolong their own lives, but it is for them to prolong as much as possible the life of the state by giving it the best possible constitution. The best constituted state will have an end, but it will end later than any other unless some unforeseen accident brings about its untimely destruction.
Thank you. So one thing he's doing here is playing on the two meanings of the word constitution, right? So what are the two meanings of this word? What are the two things constitution can mean, can refer to?
definition and you have a physical definition.
Okay, yeah, and the political definition is what?
Like our own Constitution.
Yeah, it's basically like the founding legal document of a state, right? The central legal document of a state. And then what is the other definition of constitution? Anybody who has ever played a role-playing game of any sort should probably be familiar with this.
It's like physical health.
Yeah, your physical health, right? So it improves your hit points in certain saving throws, right? Yes. And one thing that Rousseau is doing here is kind of like playing on the two, or at least Rousseau's translator, right? Is playing on the two meanings here of constitution. Because you're talking about a body, right? But it's an artificial body that's created out of laws rather than, out of veins and arteries and, flesh and what have you, right? So the physical health and longevity of the body politic is determined by how well the laws are made and constructed, right? Every state is eventually going to die, according to Rousseau. No state can last forever. But you can stave off that degeneracy by making sure that you construct as healthy a state as you can, as healthy a body politic as you can at the beginning. Does this make sense?
I suppose that's why the Roman Empire lasted so long.
Well, that would be Rousseau's argument, is that he's said at various points that they were particularly good at crafting laws, and as such, their state lasted longer than most others do. I might quibble with some of Rousseau's reading of history, but yeah, I mean, you'd certainly be making the reading in line with what he's doing. The life principle of the body politic lies in the sovereign authority. The legislative power is the heart of the state. The executive power is its brain, which causes the movement of all the parts. The brain may become paralyzed, and the individual still live. A man may remain an imbecile and live, but as soon as the heart ceases to perform its function, the animal is dead. So what's the metaphor here? What happens to the body politic in this example? If the executive power becomes disconnected from the rest,
It dies.
does it die?
It becomes at least paralyzed.
Yeah, we're talking here about like a body in a vegetative state, right? So a state in which the executive function somehow becomes paralyzed or disconnected, right? It can still survive as long as it's got laws, right? It's eventually going to run down and die. But I think part of the idea here is that structure of laws is more important, is what actually keeps that body alive. The executive function keeps it vital, keeps it moving forward. But as long as the laws are set up in the right ways, you can keep it going even after it's brain dead. Does this make sense? So yeah, he's comparing, an old society in which the executive function has become kind of paralyzed or impaired, basically to a coma victim, right? That heart will keep on beating until it doesn't. But, it doesn't necessarily need the executive function of the will to continue on. Okay. So let's go back to this whole idea of kind of general values, principles, and worldview that I wanted to start with, and we kind of got sidetracked. So, which is fine. Like I think, but what can we say about the general worldview here that's being expressed? Right? Like, what seem to be the things that Rousseau thinks are important or good? We've already kind of noted that balance and moderation seem to be really important to him, right? That seems to be a central value here. What other central values do we see?